we will shift the culture. These days, we need a culture shift in so many ways. We'll heal the sick, we'll raise the dead. So it's going back to the basics of our faith. It's done with a bit more, youthful exuberance. But not everyone is dances, but it's a whole heart thing.
want to get Chris's germs. What do they say? It's all right, only my lips have touched it. Good morning, everybody. I've had a bit on the go lately. We've got some problems. This is just a range. Last in a line, a few technical problems this morning. I couldn't get it to print and then ran out of paper, and it was all sorts of fun. Praise God, yeah, we're here. Let's start with prayer. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, here we are and here I am, and Lord, you know the week that I've had, you know where I've been and what lies ahead, Lord. You know the shape of my heart, Lord. You know my lying down and waking up. And Lord, I bring this offering to you today. Father, I pray that it speaks your word, that it speaks your truth, that it touches hearts, it opens eyes, and that people would know that you are God. So, Father, I faithfully bring this to you. I pray that it will be pleasing to you. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. USB. Is it? Hang on. I had this problem last time. Is it there on the floor, Gil? Ah, here it is. Got it. All right. We'll move on. Now, Margot always says to me, Tim, you got to keep it simple. She knows that I've got a habit of going in deep. And I've been in deep. I've been down some rabbit holes with this one. Actually, it's been like trying to catch popcorn as it flies out of a hot pan. It's one there, one there. And she says, keep it simple. Just give it to me. Give it to me straight. And so if there's anything you've got to take away from today's message, it's this. And it says, it's this. You are a way maker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. So I'm calling this message Way Maker. And I got a byline of Holy God, Promised Land, Holy Law, Holy People. Now, it probably should be Holy Law, Covenant People, because I'm not sure how holy Israel was, but they were chosen. And in Deuteronomy 9:6 it says, "Know then that it's not because of your righteousness that the Lord is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stubborn people." Now, as much as I'm calling this Waymaker, I want to call this "You've got Craig to blame" message. Because Craig triggered the apologist in me prior to Christmas. It might have even been in November sometime. He got up and he delivered a communion talk, and he spoke about some of the debates he has in his family with non-believers. And one of the things that he said was that one of the things that they bring against God in the Old Testament narrative is that Israel's taking of the Holy Land is genocide. And I get that the story's confronting because conflict is uncomfortable. I don't want comfortable. I don't want to see people die. I don't like death. The question I ask myself, however, is would we have known any different if God hadn't acted? So, what were the alternatives if life just continued on as it was? An easy out in this debate, and I didn't really want to do it. I really felt compelled. An easy out in this debate is to say, I'm glad that we live in a time of grace, but without God's intervention in that time, we would never have known grace. God can and will work through his creation, even in the face of fierce opposition. At the heart of this debate is a question about what is just. And a clear principle of justice is knowing what is good. And we live in a culture that's lost sight of this. Just got to do a bit of shuffling here so I can change channels. We've moved towards a philosophy of harm reduction. We think that harm is self-evident, and we've turned the compass inward towards us, thinking that the markers for our navigating the world are found within us. The very thing that we think will bring harmony and tolerance actually tears us apart, because we've become experts at knowing what everyone else should do, and experts at taking offence at anyone who suggests we should change our ways. Thinking that we can navigate the world with a compass that points at us is absurd. But we persist nonetheless. When we read the Bible, we insert ourselves into the position of the Canaanites and declare it to be unfair. The question we need to consider in the narrative of Israel's taking of the Promised Land is, what is the corruption and what is the correction? And if we don't know one from the other, then we're in a bit of trouble. We're in a world of strife. And I'd argue that's what the Canaanite and Amorite world was. It was strife. And so the miracle that I see in the story of the world and all that's in it is that there is a thread of life that runs through it. It runs through the chaos. And the way that leads to life is by no means the work of man. I'm convinced that man's heart leans towards the chaos. And yet a compass that turns inward towards us finds a big empty hole that needs to be filled with something. So we make gods in our own image and we magnify our own desires. So we're confronted by the smiting in the Old Testament, and yet we're enticed by it. We don't want someone else to have the power over it. We all know that they would misuse it. But we wouldn't mind some of that smiting power ourselves, would we? At the end of Luke chapter 9, it says that Jesus turns towards Israel, and this is before his ascension, and he sends messages to a village of Samaritans, and they did not receive him. As a result of the rejection, James and John ask if they can call down fire from heaven and consume them. That's the Samaritan villages. And Jesus rebukes James and John, and he says, "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of." A moral compass that points inward at us cannot discern corruption from correction. And correction is seen as harmful and is dutifully corrupted. So let's have a look at Canaan, the Promised Land. They pointed the compass at themselves, made gods in their own image, who they had to appease, and in the process made themselves enemies of God. So in looking at some of the history and going down plenty of rabbit holes, I discovered that just like God's written word, there's a battle of interpretation over the message in the real world of God's creation too. Some of the confusion may be naive, but some I suggest is deliberate. What is clear from history, however, is that the Canaanites were no shrinking violets. They weren't these innocent little people sitting there and God thought, I'm going to smite you just for fun. So if we move to the next slide, thanks Nat. No, that's the one, 9, Genesis 9. So we've got to go back in history. And we're going to go back to the time before the flood to get a bit of an understanding of who the Canaanites are. And so in Genesis 9:22 to 25, it says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it on their father. And their faces were turned away, so they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his younger son had done to him. So he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. So we see that God as I said before, God did not just come along and think that it would be fun to smite the Canaanites. He was patient. And we see that Canaan was implicated in the sin of Ham. And we don't know for sure what the specific charge is against Canaan, but we can see that irreverence prevails. In the biblical record, we know that sons and grandsons are often considered to be sons of the grandfather. A son was considered a representative of his father. And we heard Gary speak a week after Christmas, and he noted that the product of the fall was the loss of intimacy with God. And this loss of intimacy was expressed by Adam and Eve noticing that they were naked and feeling ashamed. And what we see in the account here of the curse of Canaan is that this loss of intimacy has led to irreverence, probably a lack of shame, and therefore an act of dishonour. Now I'm going to make a contentious point here, and that is to dishonour your earthly father and claim to have regard for a heavenly one is difficult to reconcile. And I know that for a lot of people their earthly father hasn't been great. But the point is, we've still got to respect the position. There's another point I want to make here, and that is, at the end of Genesis 8, God declares that he will never again curse the ground on account of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And we know that creation still groans under the weight of the curse. But the key corrective action that needs to occur has to do with the heart of man. At the start of chapter 9, God blesses Noah and his sons, and he makes a covenant with them, and the covenant respects life. It says, For in the image of God he made man. Ham and his descendants were bound by the covenant, and the rainbow is a sign of that covenant. Through the line of Ham, that covenant is broken. Through Shem, from whom Abraham descends, there is a renewal of the covenant. So if we go to Genesis 10, we'll see there that it says the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Zermarite, and the Hamathite, and afterward the families of Canaan were spread abroad. So the account says that for Cush was the father of Nimrod. He was the first mighty hunter, and the beginning of his kingdom is Babel, and then he goes on and he builds, goes into Assyria and builds Nineveh. There's also, in the Bible, Cush is often referred to as a region which is in the Upper Nile. When it comes to Mizraim, the Hebrew word for Mizraim is Egypt. And quite often you see in some translations that Mizraim is actually replaced, particularly in Genesis 10:13, with the word Egypt. And it says in this account too that the Philistines are descendants of Mizraim. And again, there's conjecture over the Philistines when you look at some of the secular accounts. They reckon that DNA says that there's links to Crete. But also there's a lot of migration through that area, so over time you would actually expect there to be a bit of a change. There's no mention of Put and the land of his descendants, but what we see in chapter 11 is the attention turned to Abraham. And really, through Abraham, as I said before, we start to see this renewing of a covenant with man. And it's a covenant that will ultimately see the greatest corrective action in all of history. One that breaks the bonds of a curse of servitude to sin and death. So we'll go to the next slide. Obviously there on that last slide there was that link to Shem from Shem through to Abraham. So I had a bit of a look around and I was trying to find some maps of Canaan, and I was trying to reconcile it to the Bible, and somebody had already done the reconciliation for Numbers 34. And so that image there is taken from a website called preceptaustin.org, specifically looking at Numbers 34. In Genesis 10:19, when it's talking about the nations, it says that the territory of the Canaanites extends from Sidon, and if you can see that on the map, up north there. And then it in Genesis 10 it sort of says that it goes across and down to Gaza and then across to Sidon and Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what you can see in that is that when it comes to Numbers 34, the Canaanite territory, broadly speaking, has expanded. And also, I guess that what's happening in Genesis 10:19 is that it's not actually the promise of the land to Abraham. It's just a mentioning of the lands that those tribes occupy. So as I said before, this map just sort of outlines what it says in Numbers 34, and in Numbers 34 it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Command the sons of Israel and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as an inheritance, even the land of Canaan according to its borders." And so instead of sort of reading all of Numbers 34 here, there it is in a picture. Now, up there I've got a timeline, and this message came to me in pieces, but I thought the timeline's pretty important because when you look in the Bible and you go back to the Exodus and then the entering into the Promised Land, we're looking at about 1400 BC roughly. And so from the time of Abraham to the time of actually taking of the Promised Land, there's a fair bit of time that goes by, so you would expect some changes in the landscape. And so the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15 says, "On the day that the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanite," so it's the land of the Canaanite, and the Kenizzite, and the Kedemite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite. This is why the Old Testament's hard, isn't it? There's so many lists of names. And the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. So that was the specific promise to Abraham. And what the good people at Precept Austin have done for me is basically map out the entirety of the land that was promised from Numbers 34, and then they've overlaid on top the land that was actually taken. That was the land that was taken by Joshua. Obviously David and Solomon continue to take land, and Israel grows. And within that there's probably another sermon about faithfulness, but I'm trying to keep things brief. And I just want to continue to look at Genesis 15, so if we can have a look at the next slide. So if we continue to look at the Genesis account, we see that before Abraham receives the boundaries of the Promised Land, he is told that his descendants will be strangers in a land not their own, and that they will be oppressed. Judgment will come upon that land and the land of inheritance. So Egypt is implicated in this as well. In Genesis chapter 9, we learnt that there was a curse on Canaan, and we note here in verse 16 that it says Amorite, that in the 4th generation they'll return here, for the wrongdoing of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now, Amorite and Canaanite are used interchangeably. Amorite was a son of Canaan, and so really when they talk about Canaanite, they're talking about all the tribes, but specifically here they're saying the Amorites. But as I said, that's interchangeable. The curse of Canaan was a result of a broken covenant, a covenant that considered us as image bearers. The sin was a betrayal of the dignity of what it is to be an image bearer. So the question for me in all of this became, what does a culture look like that does not start with a basic precept of human dignity? Because we probably need to know this if we're going to question whether God acted justly or not. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that he didn't. I'm suggesting that he did. And so for me, I went out there and I thought, what does the secular community say about the Canaanite culture? And there was a lot, but then there wasn't. And some of that makes sense if the biblical narrative is true, because some of these cities were destroyed and there wouldn't have been a lot of evidence left. But there was a little bit. And again, some of it's contentious because of that timeline. And trying to map your way through the Egyptian dynasties is really hard because there's all these co-regencies. It's hard enough in the Bible with co-regencies and where there's overlap between two regions. So there's all this argument about time, but generally speaking, well, let's first just talk about the Tel Amarna tablets. I told you I went down some rabbit holes. These are tablets that were discovered in the early 1900s, I think sort of 1930, something like that. They were accidentally found in a field. It was a site in the Upper Nile that moved from Thebes to, as a capital, to closer to the Lower Nile. I've actually forgotten the name of the city. Anyway, they established a new bureaucratic centre there, and they found all these tablets with diplomatic correspondence between nations. And so what we learned from, and so there's consensus, generally speaking, that it's 18th dynasty Egyptian pharaohs and mayors of Canaanite territory. There seems to be a secular agreement that the tablets are 1390 to 1350, so it relates pretty closely to the time of the conquests. Some Christian circles, specifically, there was one article on Answers in Genesis that reckons that the tablets are probably from around 900 BC, which corresponds with the end of Solomon's rule. So there's a bit of conjecture in this space, but the tablets mention a group called the Habiru, and some of the letters highlight a contempt in some quarters for this king of Labayu, who's the king of Shechem. And their issue with the king of Shechem was that he was working with the Habiru. And so that would be consistent with Joshua making an altar in Shechem after the invasion of however you say it. And we know that Shechem becomes the capital of Israel. All that history aside, what do the tablets tell us about what's happening in Canaanite? That's the real issue I was trying to get my head around. And the timing is a little bit irrelevant because what we're trying to look at is culture. But what it shows is that there's a relationship between Canaan and Egypt. And given the family connections, that's no surprise. It also shows that there's a fair bit of chaos in that territory. One of the king of Babylon in one of the tablets is responding to Pharaoh, who had requested one of the king's daughters, but the king of Babylon says, "I'm not going to send you a daughter. You've already got my sister. Tell me whether my sister's all right. And by the way, don't mistreat my diplomats." And then he complains also that, you know, the money that the Egyptians had sent him was meant to be gold, but it looks like silver. There's a mayor at Biblios, I think it is, it's north of Sidon, on the edge of Hittite territory, and this guy keeps complaining about interruptions to his reign, and a potential overthrow. When you look at the history, there's a fair bit of pressure coming from the Hittites, there's a fair bit of pressure coming from the Syrians, but there's this constant mention of the Habiru. And so Christian scholars are pretty much saying that it's likely that not all Habiru are the Hebrews, but any mention of Hebrews probably is linked to Habiru, because it is not considered an affectionate term. The Habiru was considered as a pain in the posterior, basically. But what's interesting is that the fact that the Habiru were there in the first place and they were making a nuisance of themselves, and Egypt was not willing to respond, was quite interesting. Now, I know I'm going down rabbit holes, but just remember, God is a way maker. What I learned from this is that really Canaan was a really desirable territory. It had key trade routes, and we know that Joseph was picked up by Midian traders and sold into Egypt. There was about 3 highways for caravans going through there. There was ports, and ports are strategically very important, particularly in area that was drought prone. So particularly going up into Turkey, and I think was it called Angolia back in the times, or Anatolia, or something like that. It was Hittite territory. And so this land was contestable. People wanted it. And so what we know is that there was heavily fortified cities. And like I said, it was under Egyptian control, and it was probably stretching the Egyptians, and probably one of the reasons that led to its downfall. I would suggest that the Exodus probably assisted that too. Now I've lost track. Canaan was a desirable territory, so the record tells us that it's rich in resources, important to trade, and the fancy word for that is that it's geopolitically important. It still is. Trade in wheat to areas that were susceptible to drought was really critical. Now, it's really hard to find out a lot about Canaan culture, and I said that, you know, one of the reasons before is because a lot of it was destroyed. But in some of the tablets that were found in Ugarit, there's also a mention that the Amorites were lawless and they didn't keep good records either. So, but like I said before, we know that there's heavily fortified cities. Port cities played an important role. Agriculture, drought had significant influences. And there was battles in these places all the time. War was a regular part of the landscape. The things that they trusted in were their allegiances, either between themselves to combat a common enemy, or from foreign influences to take ground from someone else. As I said before, the Canaanites are no shrink in violence. They knew how to handle themselves. Like most civilizations, there were slaves, and they were a big part of the economy. And yes, we know that the Israelites had slaves too, but we know that their treatment of slaves changes, and particularly if you're a Hebrew slave, you serve for 6 years and then you're set free. And also through the Hebrews, we see this notion of kinsman redeemer. And so we start to see contrast between Hebrew culture and Canaanite culture. And so from what I can tell is that the Amorites are pretty ruthless. And despite all the conjecture as to, you know, whether the walls of Jericho were there when Joshua went through and all these other distractions, it was hostile. It was a hostile place. So one of the things I had to do was pivot, and I started to think, what does it say about Canaanite religion? And I found a friend, and it's this Encyclopedia Britannica, and it's got a commentary on the Middle Eastern religions. And if we flick to the next slide, you'll see what it says. It says the ancient Middle East made a place for homosexuality and bestiality in its myths and rites. In the Asherah cult, the Quedeshim priest had a reputation for homosexual practice, even as the Quedeshot priestess for prostitution. Israel eventually banned both the Quedeshim and Quedeshot, while in Urugit, the Quedeshim and the Kohanim were priestly guilds in equally good standing. Baal is portrayed in Urugatic mythology as impregnating a heifer to sire a young bull god. And these things, they say, are basically consistent with what's found in Leviticus, and they go on to say that the Hebrew culture rejects these abominations. When they talk about Hebrews rejecting it, I'm saying God actually did that rejection. And God influenced the Hebrew culture, but then we know that they were pretty stubborn and they stumbled often. It goes on to say that, you know, the Phoenicians had, rites that contains a large number of infant burials. And again, this is consistent with the biblical accounts. Kids, close your ears. It's really hard to find anything in secular circles. They might say that it agrees with the biblical account, but they'll never go into much of the detail about these cultures. Expedition Bible have got an episode called Excavating Canaanite High Place, the Sin of the Amorites. It refers to some diggings that Robert Alexander Stewart McAllister found in Geyser in the 1900s. And it's not just infants, it's kids to the age of 7. So it seems to me there's a great willingness to criticise God, the God of the Bible, but that willingness does not extend to the rituals and practices of all other civilizations. Now, that I'm not saying that it's not right to be disturbed by the brutality recorded in the Bible. My argument is that because God intervened, it's because God intervened that we're actually disturbed by this. Our culture has been changed significantly by his intervention. I look at all the societies of the world that have been shaped by the Judeo-Christian principles and I compare them to other societies, and generally speaking, I know where I want to live. The Encyclopedia Britannica had a little bit to say about this too, and it says it remained for the prophets of Israel to single out uncompromising virtue as the overriding consideration in the good life required by God. The most important factor in the system was social justice, whereby the weak were protected in conflicts of interest with the strong. I'd suggest in the other cultures that is the complete opposite. The weak are not protected, the weak are exploited. I said at the start of the message that at the heart of justice is knowing what is good, and the Canaanites and Egyptian religions tried to make gods of mortals. They tried to make gods mortal and men gods. It was a system built on desire and appeasement. It enslaved people more than it served people, and in many respects it was elitist. The practices that we talk about, I'll go to it next. The practices we see above turn people into products. Their value is in what we can get out of them. And when this happens, women, children and lower classes generally pay the price for the decadence of the privileged. One thing that came to me late last night and early this morning was just this account in Deuteronomy 18, and it warns against false diviners, and Moses is talking initially to the Levites, but then he goes on to speak more generally, and it says, when you enter the land which the Lord God gives you, just let me get my glasses. So when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or his daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft. Now, my world, the world that I live in, is being dulled by the sexual revolution, so some of the stuff in Leviticus just washes a bit clean over me, but I read that about kids passing through the fire, and it gets me. That's evil. It is evil. And we heard a little bit about what's happening in India. It's evil. The take-home message here is that the ancient times were undoubtedly brutal times. And the Bible doesn't sugarcoat it. Everything else I read wants to sugarcoat it. They want to make it palatable to us. If you're going to have a complaint about the Bible, it's because it doesn't sugarcoat it. It tells us how it is. It's evil. I don't want to go back there. And it's possible that we could, but I'm confident that the God of the universe, our Maker and our Judge, is working for our good. And if God is working for our good, He's got to confront evil. And it's pretty clear to me from the biblical account that evil often marches out in defiance of Him, condemning itself in the process. That's all right. Just got to get my pages in order. So we can go on to the next slide, please, Nat. Now, this is where I thought I was going to start, but this is actually the finish, so rest assured it's not going to go much longer. Hear Israel, you are crossing the Jordan today, going to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities that are great and fortified to heaven, people who are great and tall, the sons of Anakim, whom you know and whom you have heard it said, who can stand against the sons of Anak? So be aware today that it is the Lord your God who is crossing over ahead of you as a consuming fire. He will destroy them and subdue them before you, so that you may drive them out and eliminate them quickly, just as the Lord has spoken to you. Do not say in your heart when the Lord your God has driven them away from you, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to take possession of this land. Rather, it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. On my cover slide I had the verse 6, which I couldn't fit on this slide. It says, "Know then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stubborn people." Deuteronomy 9:14 on face value sounds pretty harsh, but the background story tells us that God was slow to anger and the extent of the evil in those lands was great. So what we've got to realise here is that there's a bigger story at play. Yes, Israel are receiving something that they don't deserve. They're a chosen people. Through Israel, we receive something we don't deserve. There's another foreshadowing in this passage if you go on to read it. And I saw it for the first time when I was doing a previous message on who is Jesus. There's often this reference to Jesus being the prophet. And that always brought it back to the Old Testament and to a prophet like Moses coming. And I've always found it hard to compare Jesus to Moses. But what I saw in this account was the fact that Moses was interceding just as Christ intercedes for us. It says in Deuteronomy 9, verses 16 to 18, Moses says this: "When I looked, I saw that you had sinned against the Lord your God. You had made for yourselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. You had turned aside quickly from the way of the Lord, the way that the Lord had commanded you. So I took 2 tablets and threw them out of my hands, breaking them into pieces before your eyes. Then once again I fell prostrate before the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. I ate no bread and drank no water because of all the sin you had committed, doing what was evil in the Lord's sight, and so arousing his anger." Moses intercedes for Israel. Jesus intercedes for us. Now, I've contended throughout this message that we can make judgments about the pre-Christian world from the comfort of a post-Christian culture, thinking that we know better. But in doing so, we're imposing a view of the world that's been radically changed by God. And the irony is that we want to make him the villain. The big question here is God is God just? And if God isn't, I don't know what the alternative is. I don't know where I'm going to get a fairer trial. To me, the alternative is only bribery and corruption. I look at the account in Luke 9 of James and John's wanting to call down fire on the Samaritan village. So if I was judge, I know what I'd be capable of. I'd be smiting everybody. It'd be smythe fest, the smythe fest. It wouldn't be pretty. I wouldn't be as patient as God. I'd be smiting away to my heart's content. Jesus' response to James and John is that you do not know what kind of spirit you are of. There's forces at play here that I don't fully understand, but to ignore or accuse God, however, is to underestimate the power of evil. And I need somebody who can stand against it. While I mightn't know the extent of the forces at play, I do know that Rahab came out of Jericho because she feared the Lord. Fear of the Lord orientates your moral compass away from you and towards him. It allows us to discern correction from corruption and life from death. Fear of the Lord wants to be clothed in righteousness, to flee from nakedness. It welcomes correction and seeks intimacy. And God has made a way. Our God is our way maker. His promises are true. So if you're waiting and wanting to come out of Jericho, he's ready to break the walls down. That's it from me. Thank you. Somebody got a benediction for us because I didn't get to that bit. I got a benediction. It's Jesus, A. Jesus, A. And the traditionalist in me, that my Anglican background, will say this: go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thank you. Let's have a cuppa.